had every expectation that we would prevail over the enemy.
You never considered yourself safe or secure. You always had to be on the alert.
If you ever look at someone you shoot, it's a horrible sight.
We were up against an enemy for whom this war was a sacred cause.
I believe what we fought for over there was the right thing to fight for. I just think we got sold down the river.
Our objective at that time was how to make American forces withdraw completely from Vietnam.
I'm glad it's over. Glad we don't have to do this again.
I fired enough during the war that when I come back out of the war, I gave away every weapon I had.
It was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Because it was a war that we did not win. It was a war that therefore was much more difficult to let go of.
I came of age in Vietnam. I became a man in Vietnam.
You had to deal with it. You had to come to terms with it.
I'm Bernard Shaw. We're at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial here in Washington, D.C. Once denounced as a black scar, this site has become a place of healing for many Americans. Although the conflict commemorated by the wall ended 2 decades ago, it continues to influence individuals, to shape United States politics, and to resonate through our popular culture. We hear repeatedly that we do not want another Vietnam. Coming to terms with the first one may help us. That's what we'll try to do during the next 2.5 hours. On this date 20 years ago, Americans were celebrating their bicentennial. The New York Times bestseller list included books about Charles Manson and the Bermuda Triangle. Among the most watched TV shows, All in the Family and MASH. Tony Orlando and Dawn were way up on the pop singles chart. Patty Hearst was a fugitive, and Hank Aaron was poised to surpass Babe Ruth's RBI record. But a half a world away from the United States, Saigon was falling. As it did, a frantic airlift came to an end on the roof of the U.S. Embassy. CNN's Pete Arnett joins us from that same roof in a place now called Ho Chi Minh City. Peter?
Indeed, Bertie, I'm on the helipad on the roof of the U.S. Embassy. This was the center of the final evacuation, so let's look at those chaotic last few hours and the men who lived them.
So they turned the roof off, remember that?
They'd waited 20 years for this, to revisit the most dramatic hours of their lives.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have now landed at Saigon Airport.
I said, this isn't Tudo Street.
9 U.S. Marines were back in a city they never believed they would see again, and to travel the streets of Saigon in remembrance and reconciliation.
I think the best thing that coming back here and looking around and seeing what we've got is to put this thing to bed and say, hey, the war is over with. No hard feelings.
That's where the restaurant was back here right behind the antenna.
For them, the war ended not on a battlefield, but on a rooftop, with communist troops at the gates of Saigon April 29, 1975, and the airport evacuation of fleeing Vietnamese and Americans shut down, the desperate headed for the one place they might get help.
There was a natural tendency for people that were panicky to begin with to head for the flag, and that was the U.S. Embassy.
As the crowds gathered at the embassy, the Marines had to close out America's presence in Vietnam, including the burning of $6.4 million in cash from the embassy safes.
They had 6 big barrels sitting out in front of the dispersing office, and in those barrels was some kind of nitrate or whatever was in there, and they would bring the money out, dump it in those barrels.
By late afternoon, the large crowds became the priority. People began to panic and tried to force their way inside the embassy grounds.
We were in a bad situation because the crowd was growing so large. ARVNs and South Vietnamese soldiers were all over the place with weapons, and I think that we really didn't know what they were going to do because they were shooting all over the place.
There was one case there where a young lady, her father wanted her out, and right there at the main gate of the embassy threw over a whole bag of uncut jewels to try to get his daughter out of the country, which at that time I had to say no and hand the jewels back to the gentleman.
The first helicopters lifted off from the embassy grounds later that afternoon. Passengers were asked to leave their luggage behind, and bags were strewn all over. The crush of people was so great that eventually the Marines stopped the evacuation and retreated back into the embassy building. But the Vietnamese followed, using fire trucks parked in the yard.
They smashed the doors down, definitely. And like I said, it was those big fire trucks that we kept there that did the job. They knocked down the doors.
And the roof was not safe either.
And there was a crazy cowboy over there on about the 5th floor that was firing at the helicopters when they came in.
The returning Marines discovered that the bullet holes remain, and so do the sandbags, rotted now, their contents spilled onto the roof. But a reminder of their once important value.
These were the defensive lines in case we overran through the door here, because once you came up the main stairwell, you had 2 ways to go, that way and this way. And if they did overrun us, this is the only thing we had, the only defensive line we had to fight by.
Then came the waiting game on the embassy roof, because after taking out Ambassador Graham Martin in the early hours of the morning, no more helicopters came in.
I was under the impression that we'd all be out before the sun came up. And when the sun came up, we could hear the tanks and the artillery and everything coming in. At that point, I was like, you know, are we here? Is this going to be like the Alamo?
At around 7:50 a.m., a black speck in the sky turned out to be the rescue helicopter, codenamed Swift 22. The crew chief was Chris Woods.
And I remember distinctly looking out the crew door and seeing tanks out there, and my heart just stopped because it startled me to see all these tanks look like they were waiting for me.
As a reporter in Saigon in April of 1975, I watched the evacuation drama unfold. From the roof of a downtown hotel, I saw the last Marines lift off from this embassy helipad.
We did our job as Marine security guards, and then when it came down to the evacuation, you know, we were the last. We closed the door, so to speak, on Vietnam.
Sergeant Valdez snapped a picture of the thankful Marines on the last chopper out. They closed the door on Vietnam that day, but 20 years later, there was still some unfinished Marine business in old Saigon. A memorial service for 2 of their buddies, the last 2 Americans killed in the war.
Gentlemen, join with me for a minute with bowed head in a moment of silent contemplation for Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darren Judge, Marines who served with us in Saigon and were killed on the day before the end of our departure from South Vietnam.
Finally, a show of respect, a visit to the cemetery at Cu Chi. They found the grave of one Vietnamese soldier who had fallen the day they left Saigon, the day the war ended.
He did like we were doing. He believed in his cause as we believed in our cause, and we were all trying to be the best that we could be at that time and do what we had to do.
The Vietnam War was infamous for the United States. It was the first one it ever lost. Now, at the outset, that was unthinkable. How it happened, next.
That's on Showbiz Today at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on CNN.
The Vietnam War was the longest in American history and exacted a heavy toll on all sides. This is how the soldiers fought the war and remember it. It started slowly. The United States sent limited military assistance to Vietnam in the early 1960s, believing that would help the anti-communist Saigon government survive. It quickly became clear that what seemed only a small guerrilla insurgency was in reality an ugly struggle. And it was fought in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, up cloud-wrapped mountains and through jungled valleys, and across the swamps and the canals of the Mekong Delta, particularly the Delta, where in January 1963, American military planners were shocked by the defeat of superior Saigon forces by the Viet Cong at this tiny hamlet of Ap Bac.
I ordered my soldiers to wait until they got very close, and then we shot them down.
3 Viet Cong were killed in the battle, their graves still lovingly tended. But the Saigon casualties were much higher, and more importantly to Washington, 3 Americans died that day. It was a victory the communists trumpeted. Ap Bac became a symbol and inspiration for future battles, because for the first time, the Viet Cong had stood and fought and won. The first U.S. infantry units were sent to Vietnam in 1965, when it became clear the Saigon forces were not developing into a competent fighting force. The American commander, General William C. Westmoreland, favored large helicopter-backed search and destroy operations.
If you're on a sweep, you normally would move out early in the morning or in the night before, get into pre-positions, and then your blocking force would go into position. Your main force would make a sweep through an area and hopefully flush out what's ever in there into your blocking force. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
These visiting American Marines are getting target practice at Cu Chi, a former battle area northwest of Saigon. Several major U.S. military operations launched here failed because of the communist skills at concealment in underground tunnels. Now a tourist center, the Cu Chi tunnels hid troop billets, hospitals, and command centers. The tunnels were particularly effective for ambushing Americans.
And then what happens is the guy pops up like this, he shoots, and then he drops right back down, and this stuff goes right back down like it was. So there's no way that you could tell where anything was coming from.
The war soon bogged down into stalemate. The communists were relying on the Ho Chi Minh Trail for their supplies, an intricate system of hidden supply highways carved through the mountains of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. For American ground troops, the war became dreary, unproductive, repetitious, and dangerous.
You'd get up around, dawn, and you'd saddle up, put on all your gear, and start humping. And you'd walk for, an hour or so, come to a ville, cordon the village, search it. Somebody would die, somebody may not die. Then you'd leave the village. A week later, you'd come back to the village, and you'd search it. Somebody would die, somebody may not die, and you'd leave it.
The hardest thing to do was keep what I call a racer's edge, where you had to be looking not just for elements like the leeches and mosquitoes and those other things, but trying to look out for the booby traps.
Both sides continually escalated the war, and the Vietnamese population was often caught in the middle. During the Tet Offensive in 1968, Communist forces launched a coordinated series of surprise attacks across the country, including the Delta town of Bến Tre.